Why my eyes, sir? You've never used them before.
Jeffrey, thanks so much for joining us. So you left your job with Google in part because you say you want to focus solely on your concerns about AI. You've spoken out saying that AI could manipulate or possibly figure out a way to kill humans. How could it kill humans?
Well, eventually, if it gets to be much smarter than us, it'll be very good at manipulation because it will have learned that from us. And it knows how to program, so it'll figure out ways of getting around restrictions we put on it. It'll figure out ways of manipulating people to do what it wants.
Steve Wozniak, one of the co-founders of Apple, is also speaking out about the dangers he fears will come from AI. Take a listen.
Now, AI is another more powerful tool, and it's going to be used by those people, for basically really evil purposes. And I hate to see technology being used that way.
I mean, how do we even protect against bad actors or rogue nations harnessing AI?
It's like nuclear weapons. If there's a nuclear war, we all lose. And it's the same if these things take over.
What's happening is they're training the AI to lie.
Yes.
It's bad.
To lie. That's exactly right. And to withhold information.
To lie, and now what happens when something vastly smarter than the smartest person comes along in silicon form? But it is non-trivial. It has the potential of civilizational destruction. Larry Page and I used to be close friends. At least my perception was that Larry was not taking AI safety seriously enough. He's made many public statements over the years that the whole goal of Google is what's called AGI, artificial general intelligence or artificial superintelligence. He really seemed to be one sort of digital superintelligence, basically digital God, if you will, as soon as possible. And then at one point, I said, well, what about, we're going to make sure humanity's okay here. And they called me a speciesist. I was like, okay, that's it. Yes, I'm a speciesist. Okay, you got me. What are you?
There is likely a berserk wing of the artificial intelligence community that intentionally or unintentionally could use artificial intelligence to kill all of us and hurt us the entire time that we are dying. Please tell me in plain English 2 or 3 reforms, regulations, if any, that you would implement if you were queen or king for a day.
I think it comes back again to transparency and explainability in AI. We absolutely need to know and have companies attest.
What do you mean by transparency?
So disclosure of the data that's used to train AI, disclosure of the model and how it performs, and making sure that there's continuous governance over these models, that we are the leading edge in
governance by whom?
Technology governance, organizational governance.
So how exactly will the future masters of the planet look like? This will be decided by the people who own the data. Now, why is data so important? It's important because we've reached the point when we can hack not just computers, we can hack human beings and other organisms.
Gutenberg printed the Bible in the middle of the 15th century, but it did not create a single new page. It had no ideas of its own about the Bible. Is it good? Is it bad? How to interpret this? How to interpret that? AI can create new ideas.
Can even write a new Bible.
Throughout history, religions dreamt about having a book written by a superhuman intelligence, by a non-human entity. In a few years, there might be religions that are actually correct. Just think about a religion whose holy book is written by an AI. That could be a reality in a few years.
At the interview, Elon Musk, again, features as the hero figure in an unfolding technodrama that looms large, an existential threat to humanity. While Musk was pivotal in its development, he continues to play the role of humanity's advocate in what he deems an inevitable turn. Larry Page and his billionaire colleagues of Silicon Valley are part of a very strange and dangerous movement. Some of you will say, well, it's a transhumanist cult. Indeed it is, but there's much more to it than that. Where should I begin? How about Burning Man? Burning Man is a 9-day festival founded by political activist Larry Harvey and a small group of his anarchist fellows from San Francisco back in the 1980s, who were known as quote-unquote pranksters in a variety of evolving little cliques. The Suicide Club, and later the Cacophony Society, of which the movie Fight Club and its Project Mayhem was based upon, were into nihilism and orchestrated acts of chaos and dark saturnalia as political activism. The idea was to destroy something beautiful, like a piece of public art, an idea first developed by political activist Gustav Metzger to commit acts of civil disobedience, of destruction, a process that didn't stop at the self. Metzger was a member of the Committee of 100, a British group formed in 1960 by Bertrand Russell. Harvey insists his festival is not modeled after the pagan ritual of burning the Wicker Man as depicted in the 1973 film, despite the fact that it follows its heathen philosophy almost to the letter. Today, Burning Man's CEO is Marion Goodell, whose job it is to, quote, facilitate and extend the Burning Man ethos all over the world, end quote. Taken from her bio from none other than the Esalen website. More about that in a bit. The city is guided from a set of principles all rooted in pagan-inspired communistic ideology. Burning Man is designed to experiment, practice, and celebrate the idea of a working, humanistic, futurist utopia. In an article from back in 2013, Page revealed, quote, a radical vision for a semi-lawless utopia where technologists could experiment with society, end quote. Page was speaking at I.O., Google's big conference for developers. Quote, the sort of mechanisms that Page wants are a place removed from the rest of the world without laws or regulations, where tech people can test out new ideas, end quote. Comparing his idea to Burning Man, he continues, quote, I think as technologists we should have some safe places where we can try out some new things and figure out what is the effect on society, what's the effect on people, without having to deploy kind of into the normal world, end quote. Sounds a lot like a human rat study to me. Sergey Brin and Larry Page, the founders of Google, are devoted quote-unquote burners. The first ever Google Doodle from 1998 was the Google logo with the Burning Man stick figure symbol. Google founder Page now owns most of Burning Man, otherwise known as Black Rock City Incorporated, having purchased 51% of its shares. The key to their relationship is their shared lineage in the counterculture of the 1960s, more specifically under the techno-utopian ideology of Stuart Brand. Student of Paul Ehrlich and his wildly debunked book Population Bomb, Brand largely shaped the early internet and personal computer quote-unquote culture revolution. His famous quote, "We are as gods and might as well get good at it," set into motion several projects that seemed environmental but were more like very rich people playing God with nature while building a pagan-inspired global technocracy. Brand believed that mankind should embrace technology as a means of salvation and liberation, which, if you haven't picked up on it yet, is the precise underpinning of the world communist ideology. The revolution would come through personal computers, and more specifically, the internet, which he called, quote-unquote, the well, coupled with the use of cybernetics. In a Rolling Stone article, which he wrote in 1972, Brand sees the World Wide Web, or cyberspace, as, quote, some sort of fourth dimension, and the possibilities were both empowering and limitless, end quote. He promoted ideas like genetically modifying humans, merging humans with machines, cybernetics and mind control, reviving extinct animal and plant species, creating Jurassic Park, very literally, in the hopes that they can turn the environmental clock backward to a prehistoric time. a time which he believes is when the Earth was undefiled by human existence, and of course, to fix the problem of Paul Ehrlich's global warming. If you've watched my analysis of the original The Wicker Man, you'll see that this film portrayed precisely this cult mindset and was predictive programming of this very idea, but of course packaged and sold to 60s counterculturalists as being a cool and hip new way of thinking in spite of its classification as a horror film. In the original version, the Isle is headed by a man, Lord Summerisle. In a pivotal scene, he explains how their community came to be. He explains that in 1868, his grandfather, a distinguished Victorian scientist, agronomist, and free thinker, bought the island to grow several strains of genetically modified fruits and vegetables that he had already developed in his lab.
See, his experiments had led him to believe that it was possible to induce here the successful growth of certain new strains of fruit that he had developed. The best way of accomplishing this, so it seemed to him, was to rouse the people from their apathy by giving them back their joyous old gods. And that as a result of this worship, the barren island would burgeon and bring forth fruit in great abundance.
Is Lord Summerisle suggesting that a strategy that incorporated an ancient pagan worldview would ensure devoted laborers for their scientific and social experiment? Is he hinting that their former apathy was caused by Christianity, which created a stumbling block for their progressive, futuristic plan?
Well, of course, to begin with, they worked for him because he fed them and clothed them. But then later, when the trees started fruiting, it became a very different matter. What my grandfather had started out of expediency, my father continued out of love. He brought me up the same way, to reverence the music and the drama and the rituals of the old gods, to love nature and to fear it, and to rely on it and to appease it where necessary. He brought you up to be a pagan! A heathen, conceivably, but not, I hope, an unenlightened one.
And then the story crescendos at the martyring of an obedient Christian following a procession led by Lord Summerisle, costumed in traditional pagan, Gnostic, androgynous ritual garb.
No matter what you do, you can't change the fact that I believe in the life eternal as promised to us by our Lord Jesus Christ.
That is good. For believing what you do, we confer upon you a martyr's death. You will not only have life eternal, but you will sit with the saints among the elect. Come. It is time to keep your appointment with the Wicker Man.
Stuart Brand wanted to cover the Earth with self-sustaining, techno-enhanced, LSD-taking utopian communes. He created the Whole Earth Catalog, a counterculture magazine and product catalog that focused on the instruction, philosophy, and products to build these imagined societies, which followed a very radical socialist Darwinian, New Age, eco-techno mentality where there exists no caste systems outside of the scientific priest class, of course.
When I was young, there was an amazing publication called the Whole Earth Catalog, which was one of the Bibles of my generation. It was created by a fellow named Stuart Brand, not far from here in Menlo Park. This was in the late 60s, before personal computers and desktop publishing. It was sort of like Google in paperback form, 35 years before Google came along.
It's interesting that Stuart Brand was at one time in the military and a short time later took part in legitimate university-held LSD studies with friend Ken Kesey, author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which fostered the notion that society is a prison and the only true quote-unquote free people are the insane. Brand claims that the Whole Earth Catalog was inspired by one of his acid trips. Just like the other Alphabet Agency psychonauts like Terence McKenna and Timothy Leary, Brand's psychedelic experience gave him a global perspective that revealed the Earth was overpopulated, it's running out of resources, and unless we abandon religion and Christianity in particular, our extinction is, well, imminent. Interesting how that works. From his book, Tavistock Institute, Social Engineering the Masses, penned by Daniel Estulin, he talks about the LSD experiments which took place at the VA hospital in Palo Alto, California, by Aldous Huxley collaborator Gregory Bateson, former OSS member and husband of Margaret Mead, under the auspices of creating an LSD cult and cultivating the worldview of the hippies who were quote-unquote programmed. Quote, through LSD experimentation on patients already hospitalized for psychological problems, Bateson established a core of initiates into the psychedelic ISIS cult, end quote. Foremost among his Palo Alto recruits were beat poet Allen Ginsberg, the original members of the Grateful Dead. And Ken Kesey, all courtesy of OSS Research and the U.S. Navy. Kesey went on to organize a circle of initiates called the Merry Pranksters, of which Brand became a pivotal member. In an article from 1992 by Michael Minicino, one of the first persons to expose the culture-destroying think tank known as the name we can't speak of here, and hereinafter I will just simply refer to it as the School of Frank, and who were in cahoots with Tavistock, quote, hallucinogens have the singular effect of making the victim asocial, totally self-centered, and concerned with objects. Even the most banal objects take on the aura which Walter Benjamin had talked about, and become timeless and delusionarily profound. In other words, hallucinogens instantaneously achieve a state of mind identical to that prescribed by the School of Frank theories, creating a brilliant re-entry point, and it was fully exploited. Quote, the long hair, sandals, free love communes, macrobiotic food, and liberated lifestyles have been designed at the turn of the century, thoroughly field-tested by various School of Frank-connected New Age social experiments before 1920. The social planners who shaped the 1960s simply relied upon already available materials, taking the entire charade one step further, beyond sanity and into the world of superdrugs to be used for behavior modification and mind control tasking, a key that would eventually allow unfettered access to the human mind, end quote. Or as counterintelligence agent and former Trotskyite Jeffrey Steinberg of the Executive Intelligence Review suggested that there was concerted effort launched by the School of Frank and the London Tavistock Institute to use the Marxist Freudian perversion of psychology and other social sciences as instruments for mass social control and brainwashing. The two pillars of the assault on the American intellectual tradition were cybernetics and the drug culture, end quote. Estelin continues, quote, drug culture was precisely the weapon that the School of Frank employed over the next 50 years to create a cultural paradigm shift away from the so-called authoritarian matrix of man in the living image of God, and transformed it into an erotic, perverse matrix. For the Marxist Freudian revolutionaries of the School of Frank, the ultimate antidote to the hated Western Judeo-Christian civilization was to tear that civilization down from the inside by turning out generations of quote-unquote NECRO-philiacs. This was instrumental to the sex, drugs, and rock and roll social engineering effort first theorized by Theodor Adorno and executed by Tavistock and its recruited operatives known as quote-unquote shock troops for the purposes of deliberately making people schizophrenic. Adorno writes in his 1948 book, The Philosophy of Modern Music, that the purpose of modern music is to literally drive the listener insane. He justifies this by asserting that modern Judeo-Christian society was actually a hotbed of evil authoritarianism, and that only by first destroying civilization through the spread of all forms of cultural pessimism and perversity could liberation occur. On the role of modern music, he wrote, quote, it is not that schizophrenia is directly expressed therein, but the music imprints upon itself an attitude similar to that of the mentally ill. The individual brings about his own disintegration. Its concern is to dominate schizophrenic traits through the aesthetic consciousness. In doing so, it would hope to vindicate insanity as true health. NECRO-philia, he added, quote, is the ultimate expression of true health in this sick society, end quote.
What we're thinking about is a peaceful planet. We're not thinking about anything else. We might think about moving the whole human race ahead a step or a few steps.
Do you think that your movement or your idea, the hip idea, is essentially connected up with drugs?
Yeah, I would say that's a large part of the framework.
I think, personally, that the more people turn on, the better world it's going to be.
The ISIS cult, as described by Estelin in his heavily sourced and cited book, persists under the British monarchy, the parasitic aristocratic elite class of Britain, and its dominating of the feudalist factions of the Aristotelian, Freemasonic, secret societies. They've resorted to the promotion of Dionysian cults, of whose practices, rites, and ceremonies date back to the Egyptian priesthood of the 3rd millennium BC. Quote, "These secret rituals have been kept inside the British royal family and their ruling class friends for centuries. The ISIS priesthood is a closed circle, and its nobility practiced social control, exploitation, and total subjugation of man's free will." End quote. Occultist Helena Blavatsky further popularized the ISIS cult through her book, ISIS Unveiled. Blavatsky was part of British intelligence and tasked with creating a new religion as an espionage front politically similar to the Oracle of Delphi. The ISIS cult is an Hellenistic Atlantean Luciferian cult that leans heavily on Greco-Roman adaptations and is taken from several esoteric sources, mainly Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry. Hints on what this might look like today consider the royal coach King Charles used for his coronation, first used by King George IV for his coronation, and Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge of England from 1790 to 1813. The coach is covered in Renaissance-era esoteric symbols, including an allegory of Roman gods and goddesses victorious at war. There are 4 gilded statues of sea titans, namely the Greek god of the sea Triton, son of Poseidon and Aphrodite, heralding the king's arrival through a conch in the front of the coach and holding his trident in the rear. At the top, holding the royal crown, are 3 cupids representing England, Ireland, and Scotland. These are not cherubim, the powerful and terrifying 4-headed, 4-winged celestial beings. They are Cupid, a god from Roman mythology, adopted from its Greek counterpart Eros, son of Aphrodite, god of erotic love and desire, and always depicted as a chubby male-winged toddler with a bow and arrow. There is scholarship that suggests the Titans were the offspring of the Watchers from Genesis 6 and the Book of Enoch we know as the Nephilim, or the giant clans, and that certain bloodlines of monarchies and other aristocratic families that persist today believe themselves descendants of these. Zoom on over to the notorious island of you-know-who, and you'll see many of the same Atlantean and Freemasonic symbols, the Titan gods of the sea, and 2 large golden cockatoos. These birds are a symbol for good trade relations between 2 factions, as the 13th century Sultan of Babylon sent a white cockatoo from Indonesia to the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, of which depictions of this bird symbolism is preserved in an Italian Renaissance painting titled Madonna della Vittoria. In an article, Rethinking Symbols of Sanctity and Patterns of Trade, the author writes of the painting that the imagery revealed the complexity and range of Southeast Asian trading networks prior to direct European contact, and that since the cockatoo can sustain a very long journey, it became a noble symbol for this level of trading prowess between the Sultan and Frederick II. Just prior to the Sixth Crusade, Pope Gregory excommunicated Frederick, referring to him as the quote-unquote son of Satan. Frederick then married Isabella II, heiress to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. This marriage granted Frederick personal and dynastic interest in Jerusalem, wanting to make his new kingdom as large, strong, and prosperous as possible. The Sultan grants him the gift of the cockatoo, as well as an offer to deliver Jerusalem to him in exchange for Frederick's help in defeating his brother, the Sultan of Damascus. This is not a big area of study for me, so don't write me angry emails if I don't have all these details absolutely correct. But beside being a nod to the Knights Templar, it's also a nod to one of the many kingly claims of the Holy Land made by British nobles and their deals with ruling powers to secure and prosper from the claim. In a journal article for Liberty University titled The Ethnicity of the Antichrist, while it is widely believed that the Antichrist will be of Jewish origin, upon closer examination, there's no real scriptural basis for such a view. In fact, the Bible teaches that the Antichrist will be of Gentile and possibly Roman descent, at least from the revived Roman Empire. I will link this and every source used in this video in the companion article located on my website.
You found on the whole in your own life that the pursuit of either mathematics or philosophy has given you some sort of substitute for religious emotion?
Yes, it certainly did. I mean, until I was about 40, I think, I got the sort of satisfaction that Plato says you can get out of mathematics. It was an eternal world. It was a timeless world. It was a world where there was a possibility of a certain kind of perfection.
English noble Bertrand Russell joined the School of Frank in their effort at mass social engineering for the distinct purpose of obliterating man's individual creative powers, as well as to destroy European and American cultures, which he wrote about in his 1951 book, The Impact of Science on Society, in which he claims Pavlov and Freud have laid the foundation for these techniques. Propaganda, disguised as education, creating a new social religion, combined with operant conditioning, Russell claimed, quote, "The subject will make great strides when it is taken up by scientists under a scientific dictatorship. The social psychologists of the future will have a number of classes of school children on whom they will try different methods of producing an unshakable conviction that snow is black. First, that the influence of the home is obstructive. Second, not much can be done unless indoctrination begins before the age of 10. Third, verses set to music and repeatedly intoned are very effective. Fourth, that the opinion that snow is white must be held to show a morbid taste for eccentricity. Although this science will be diligently studied, it will be rigidly confined to the governing class. The populace will not be allowed to know how its convictions were generated." End quote.
Nevertheless, you were thrown out of another college at the same time.
But that was for quite different reasons. That was on the ground of my views about managing morals. That was a Roman Catholic business. There was a woman who was intending to send her daughter to the college in the city of New York. This woman professed to be afraid that I should rape her daughter or corrupt her in some way by my mere presence in other classrooms in the same university. And she accused me of being lewd, lecherous, lascivious, obscene, and aphrodisiac. And all these charges were upheld by the judge in court, and the judge said that he would therefore annul this appointment.
Did she bring any evidence to justify these charges?
Yes, oh yes, it was proved.
As a result of that alarming experience, have you felt any permanent resentment against the Americans?
Oh, no, not ever. My father, when he stood for Parliament in a rural constituency in 1868, suffered in exactly the same way, for exactly the same causes. And I allowed myself to reflect that urban New York in 1940 was exactly at the same point in the road towards enlightenment as rural England in 1868.
It was Bertrand Russell who devised the scheme of mass drugging of populations as a method of social control, as well as the modification of the use of language to provide mass social manipulation through linguistics, cleverly depicted in Orwell's 1984.
It's a beautiful thing, the destruction of words. You won't have seen the dictionary 10th edition yet, Smith. It's that thing. The 11th edition, look at that thing.
Well, the revolution will be complete when the language is perfect.
The secret is to move from translation to direct thought to automatic response. Language coming from here, not from here.
Aldous Huxley picked up the drug idea and ran with it to extraordinarily influential extremes. Huxley was tutored and mentored by another Fabian socialist, H.G. Wells, who went on to become the head of British Foreign Intelligence and wrote books like The Open Conspiracy, Blueprint for a World Revolution, and The New World Order. Huxley was deeply entrenched in British intelligence and its Fabian socialist revolutionary goals of world government ruled by Britain's Round Table elite. Huxley was initiated into the quote-unquote Children of the Sun Dionysian cult, comprised of the same circle of elites in the Royal Society, where he obtained the intellectual material for his novel Brave New World. In Huxley's own words, the novel is not a warning, but rather the schematic for a future one-world socialist government and how it can be realized to destroy sovereign nation-state powers and its cultural and religious traditions, and to further human evolution for a very specific group of carefully selected elite while maintaining a slave class of laborers by scientifically engineering its citizens. Incidentally, H.G. Wells introduced Huxley to Aleister Crowley. another member of British intelligence, who furthered a modified version of the ISIS cult with the Order of the Golden Dawn and other offshoots that followed. Blavatsky played a role in these schemes, who called for the British aristocracy to organize itself into an ISIS priesthood. In his speech on the U.S. State Department's Voice of America in 1961, Huxley spoke of a world of pharmacologically manipulated slaves living in a quote-unquote concentration camp of the mind, enhanced by propaganda and psychotropic drugs, and abandoning all will to resist. This, Huxley concluded, is the final revolution, end quote. In his book, Transhumanism, The History of a Dangerous Idea, the author details the relationship all these troops had with Huxley, like Dr. Timothy Leary. Leary and Huxley had become friends after Tim's reading of The Doors of Perception, and according to his autobiographical account of the Harvard University psychedelic drug project named Flashback, Huxley instructed Leary, quote, "Your role is quite simple, Timothy. Become a cheerleader for evolution. Initiate artists, writers, poets, jazz musicians, elegant courtesans, painters, rich bohemians, and they will initiate the intelligent rich. These brain drugs, mass-produced in laboratories, will bring about vast changes in society. The obstacle to this evolution, Timothy, is the Bible," end quote. And Leary added, quote, "We had run up against the Judeo-Christian commitment to one God, one religion, one reality that has cursed Europe and America since our founding days. Drugs that can open the mind to multiple realities inevitably lead to a polytheistic view of the universe. We sensed that the time for a new humanist religion based on intelligence, good-natured pluralism, and scientific paganism has arrived," end quote. The author continues, quote, "Leary also believed he was Crowley reborn and was supposed to complete the work that Crowley began. Leary confessed in an interview with Late Night America on PBS, quote, "Well, I've been an admirer of Aleister Crowley. I think I'm carrying on much of the work that he started over 100 years ago. I'm sorry he isn't around now to appreciate the glories that he started," end quote.
I'm a philosopher. I'm a psychologist who has been studying the nervous system for the last 30 years. I probably know as much or more about how the nervous system works, the far galactic outposts of awareness and the range of human experience as any scientist around. So knowing that the nervous system is the key to all human knowledge, I've been looking for instruments just like microscopes, to see how the mind and nervous system works. The nervous system is a biochemical structure. Drugs are one of the major tools.
In Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception, he declares that the completely organized society will be brought about by the abolition of free will through methodical conditioning, and servitude made acceptable by keeping everyone in a chemically induced autistic-like state. Gregory Bateson furthered Huxley's experiments out of the Palo Alto VA hospital, and by 1967, the Kesey cult, along with Stuart Brand, had distributed massive quantities of LSD to the growing population of Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco hippies, along with an enormous propaganda effort intensifying the New Age occult movement. It was Stuart Brand who prompted NASA to release the first satellite image of the Earth as seen from space. It was this photo that inspired Carl Sagan, another pantheistic transhumanist, to write Pale Blue Dot. Sagan dedicates an entire chapter to the cosmist immortalists, the architects of the Bolshevik transhumanist movement, which is the Silicon Valley transhumanist cult of today in its embryo stage that I talked about in my recent video. The cosmists built their entire megalomaniacal philosophy upon a couple drastically misinterpreted, cherry-picked Bible verses, and when contorted in this way, conveniently turn men into gods who, through science and innovation, can become immortal, and after having done so, now have the moral duty of, quote-unquote, completing creation. This is done by recoding nature, and then colonizing space by sending up super artificial machine intelligence, and live forever in real-life Star Trek. I wish I were kidding. Sagan writes, quote, "Many religions, from Hinduism to Gnostic Christianity to Mormon doctrine, teach that, as impious as it may sound, it is the goal of humans to become gods." Or consider a story in the Jewish Talmud left out of the book of Genesis. In the garden, God tells Eve and Adam that he has intentionally left the universe unfinished. It is the responsibility of humans over countless generations to participate with God in a glorious experiment, completing the creation. Of course, the Bible says no such thing. Quite the contrary, in fact. The Talmud was never considered part of the Bible canon, as its writings were compiled in the 4th century, almost a millennium after the Torah was canonized. God created the heavens and the earth in 6 cosmic days. He looked at it and it was good, finished, complete. And on the 7th day he rested. There is nothing in there about creating machine supermen to travel into space, to colonize other planets, and become gods to finish what is already finished. Incidentally, works like Arthur C. Clarke's Space Odyssey series and H.G. Wells' numerous science fiction works were literally and very deliberately the visual Bibles of these Fabian-esque Freemasonic Gnostic Luciferians. It's not just the details of their transhumanist religion, but it's the mapping in dramatic form the trajectory of their plans. If it sounds completely crazy, if it sounds nuts, it's because it is. Clarke writes of machine superintelligence monoliths that are dispersed throughout the universe to quote-unquote further evolution. In the story, the monoliths turn Jupiter into a new sun named Lucifer that ignites the genesis of life on Europa in a cosmic-level alchemical process. Jupiter, named after the chief deity of the ancient Roman Empire's state religion, from the implosion hurls a massive pyramid comprised of pure diamond to the surface of Europa. Lucifer's core is comprised of the most precious gem. The remnants of the diamond dust orbit Lucifer like some cosmic halo, which of course is where the Beatles song "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds" derives. Song lyrics from the majority of the Beatles catalog reported to be penned by Theodore Adorno himself.
And what I want to discuss today is one particularly important possibilities that we are now facing, which is the rise of artificial intelligence and the potential that artificial intelligence will become the dominant life form on Earth and even beyond the Earth. And what would that mean for Homo sapiens? Because what's happening now is maybe not just the most important revolution in human history, but the most important revolution in biology since the beginning of life, at least on Earth. All life forms for 4 billion years evolved by natural selection, and all life forms were restricted to the organic realm. This is now changing. We are on the verge not only of replacing natural selection with intelligent design, not the intelligent design of some god, our intelligent design as the principal motor of the evolution of life. We are also on the verge of allowing life to break out for the first time from the organic realm into the inorganic and creating the first inorganic life forms after 4 billion years of evolution, which also implies that life will for the first time have a serious chance of breaking out of planet Earth and beginning to spread in the rest of the galaxy, in the rest of the universe. Organic life have been adapted to the very unique conditions of this planet for 4 billion years. So despite what you see on Star Trek, which is just now celebrating 50 years, it's extremely difficult to sustain organic life in outer space or on other planets, which is why it's very unlikely that organic life will be able to spread and to flourish outside Earth. Once you switch from organic to inorganic, it becomes much easier. So we are really on the verge of these two intertwined revolutions, moving from the organic to the inorganic and moving from planet Earth actually to the rest of the universe, to the rest of the galaxy.
Of course, in the final book, 3001 The Final Odyssey, Hal has now merged with Bowman into a single digital conscious entity named Halman, who resides in the cosmic machine matrix of monoliths and who all answer to some unknown superior monolith supervisor that exists 450 light years away. It is this monolith supervisor who gives instructions to destroy humanity due to its utter failure as a species, due in large part to the world wars. And this is done by the rapid assemblage of monoliths that form a massive disk that blocks all solar light of the sun and of Lucifer from reaching mankind. This was intended so that the evolution of the Europans could safely continue without interference from the very bad and very stupid Earth humans. Blocking out the sun to depopulate the planet so that it can be saved for a very small group of people sounds awfully familiar. Here are some archived pages from Stuart Brand's Whole Earth catalog. According to Brand, the post-revolution utopia is not for everyone, only the enlightened quote-unquote children of the sun like Brand here, who wears the Crowleyan astral sphere on his forehead. In one issue, there's an article titled World Game, written by Brand's friend, Gene Youngblood. Buckminster Fuller was the guy who invented the geodesic domes like the ones depicted in the 70s sci-fi movie Logan's Run and used in Disney's Epcot Future City prototype. He was also big on cybernetics and mind control. The work that put Youngblood on the map was his book titled Expanded Cinema, of which Fuller wrote the introduction. The book details the use of cybernetics in video and film, in other words, creating sophisticated propaganda that impacts both the brain and central nervous system in order to alter the way people think and ultimately behave. Through the use of stunning quote-unquote consciousness-expanding cinematography, images that instill a sense of awe, like the ones used in 2001: A Space Odyssey. It was believed that creating a sense of awe was the equivalent of a religious experience, of experiencing God. Youngblood employed the use of pulsating repetitive sounds and lights, and the mixing of opposites, which he calls quote-unquote simultaneous perception of harmonic opposites, or synesthesis, to create cognitive dissonance and other physiological and emotional changes. Youngblood writes, quote, synesthetic and psychedelic mean approximately the same thing. It means the simultaneous perception of harmonic opposites. It's as old as the ancient Greeks who coined the term. Under the influence of mind-manifesting hallucinogens, one experiences synesthesia, in addition to what Dr. John Lilly calls quote-unquote white noise, or random signals in the control mechanism of the human biocomputer, end quote. Incidentally, John Lilly, contemporary of Gregory Bateson, was monstrous with his ideas and LSD experimentation in mind control, and wrote a book titled Programming and Metaprogramming in the Human Biocomputer. This is the lunatic that conducted mind control experiments for the CIA and MKUltra programs, that used LSD, mirrors, and flashing projected images, wrote a book titled Simulations of God, and dosed dolphins for NASA in the hopes that he could create mind-controlled weaponized aquatic animals, among other things. An example of synesthetics would be the dualistic use of a calm symphonic music score accompanying a bloody war massacre. Hollywood does this all the time. It takes something beautiful and happy and puts it with something foul and evil. This is intended to subvert the mind, change the brain. Change the brain, change the man. Get it? But change him into what exactly? In his book, he argues that a new expanded cinema is required for a new consciousness. Quote, expanded cinema isn't a movie at all. Like life, it's a process of becoming, man's ongoing historical drive to manifest his consciousness outside of his mind, in front of his eyes, end quote. In other words, simulacra and simulation. He describes television as the quote-unquote software of the planet, and that computers liberate man and amplify his intelligence.
Just relating back to your original assertion regarding technology making religion obsolete, can you really say that technology will answer the kind of timeless questions that religion is always supposed to be able to answer, like what happens after death, or more subjective questions regarding morality and things like that?
Yes, I think that experiences of awe are, to me, the most sort of transcendent experiences. I never had them from religion, but I certainly get them when I watch, the Hubble IMAX 3D film. And when you consider what the Hubble is, it's an instrument of math. It's an optic nerve floating in space that allows us to mainline the whole of time through our own optic nerves, to quote my friend Ross Anderson. And so when you consider what that does, to be able to gawk at all of space and time and fit that something as vast as that through something as small as our brain, to contemplate and push our perceptual boundaries to such a degree that we have to upgrade our mental schemata just to accommodate the scale of that experience, I say that expands our consciousness. I think that is a psychedelic experience that is an experience of that which exceeds our intellectual capacity.
She wants to come back at you.
Which is what Joseph Campbell refers to as God to begin with, that which exceeds our intellectual capacity.
That idea of having a transcendent dimension is one of the key facets of religious identity.
Right, except religion is never based
but
on
at the
any
same
fact
time,
or science.
In an article from 2020, quote, Gene Youngblood's opus, Expanded Cinema, is a manifesto and a prophecy, end quote. He mentions some experiments that were conducted on public television. He says his references come from the Esalen Institute, the New Age think tank and quote-unquote humanistic education center located in Big Sur. It's run by Stanford University-trained psychologists and New Age psychonauts Michael Murphy and Dick Price. The Institute was inspired by founding members like Aldous Huxley and Gnostic Luciferian and alchemist Frederick Spiegelberg, and of course populated with highbrow intellectuals. It's the birthplace of the quote-unquote human potential movement, which is this collective that attempt to cultivate superpowers like ESP, telekinesis, and remote viewing as part of human evolution into the Übermenschen, the superhuman. The article explains, quote, his fanatical forecasting, which sometimes lends itself to ahistoricity, meaning it's made-up hogwash. You catch a glint of Silicon Valley, global village utopianism. It's not such a broad leap from Big Sur to Burning Man. For Youngblood, born in 1942, he and his approximate contemporaries represent a new stage in human evolution, blinking at the bright dawn of what he deems the Paleo-Cybernetic Age, end quote. In an article by Douglas Rushkoff, who wrote a book titled Team Human in 2019, he talks about the prevailing quote-unquote religion of Silicon Valley and how it's largely anti-human. He describes it as, quote, a techno-utopian and deeply anti-human sensibility, born out of a little-known confluence of American and Soviet New Age philosophers, scientists, and spiritualists, who met up in the 1980s hoping to prevent nuclear war, but who ended up hatching a worldview that's arguably as dangerous to the human future as any atom bomb, end quote. He pieced together his book through interviews with people involved in the Esalen Track 2 diplomacy program, which was intended to bring together leading scientists and spiritualists of both the USSR and the United States to the Esalen Institute. It was at Esalen where these people had brainstorming sessions that resulted in, quote, folks from Stanford Research Institute and Silicon Valley who would one day be responsible for funding and building our biggest technology firms, met up with Russia's cosmists. The cosmists were a big hit, and their promise of life extension technologies quickly overtook geopolitics as the primary goal of the conferences. Self-actualization through technology meant leaving the body behind, but that was okay, since, in keeping with the Gnostic tradition, the body was the source of human sin and corruption. The stuff robots and computers could reproduce was the best stuff about us anyway, end quote. He continues, quote, the cosmists talked about reassembling human beings atom by atom after death, moving one's consciousness into a robot and colonizing space. They believed human beings could not only transcend the limits of our mortal shell, but also manifest physically through new machines. With a compellingly optimistic, have your cake and eat it too gusto, the cosmists told America's LSD-taking spiritualists that technology could give them a way to beat death, end quote. Google is developing artificial intelligence to replace human consciousness with something far superior, AGI. Rushkoff further explains that the anti-human agenda works very neatly with the agenda of the global corporate oligarchy. Quote, each enables the other, reinforcing an abstract growth-based scheme of infinite expansion, utterly incompatible with human life or the sustainability of our ecosystem. They both depend on a transcended climax, where the chrysalis of matter is left behind and humanity is reborn as pure consciousness or pure capital, end quote.
Humanity basically learned to produce was all kinds of stuff like textiles and shoes and weapons and vehicles. And this was enough for very few countries that underwent the revolution fast enough to subjugate everybody else. What we're talking about now is like a second industrial revolution
But the product this time will not be textiles or machines or vehicles or even weapons. The product this time will be humans themselves. We're basically learning to produce bodies and minds. Bodies and minds are going to be, I think, the two main products of the next wave of all these changes. Then this is far greater than anything we saw before in history. And this time, if you're not part of the revolution fast enough, then you probably become extinct.
Larry Page, Sergey Brin, and another self-proclaimed God-man and psychonaut, Jason Silva, helped finance Singularity University, founded by futurists Ray Kurzweil and Peter Diamandis. Singularity University is a transhumanist think tank formed to peddle their nonsensical globalist ideas that they think will turn the world and later the entire universe into real-life Star Trek. Silva is one of the mouthpieces for this movement. Listen as he advocates not just for Singularity University, but for their machine god, whom they hope will run the world.
We're living in an age of technological disruption where every industry is being upended by exponential technologies. You might have heard the buzzword, yet most of us continue to be future blind, failing to see things coming. Now, in May 2007, renowned futurist Ray Kurzweil and space entrepreneur Peter Diamandis got together and started having a conversation. The conversation was the decision to create Singularity University, a university to bring together thinkers, academics, and entrepreneurs to address the grand challenges of humanity through an exponential lens. How does this change what we become capable of, right? In a world of doom and gloom, where if it bleeds, it leads. Where if it bleeds, it leads. Where if it bleeds, it leads. Most people think the world is going to hell. Yet on the back of exponential technologies, we could address the grand challenges of humanity and fix the world.
Diamandis preaches on the notion that human minds will soon be uploaded into a computer and therefore achieve immortality. He's a big advocate for brains in vats, Ready Player One style societies, where people build their own virtual worlds and subsist within them. He speaks of human biology in machine terms.
If I had to say my mission, it's to help inspire and guide the transformation of humanity on and off the Earth. Life began on this planet some billions of years ago. We're living on a planet of 4.5 billion years of age. And life itself is a technology, so to speak. It is a biological, DNA-based encoding and technology that has been improving in its capabilities from prokaryotic, simple life to you and I that are a collection of 10 trillion cells. This improvement has been one that continues. It doesn't continue biologically. In other words, we're not evolving at a rapid rate as humans. We're evolving in society, and we're evolving our tools as technologists. This kind of technology will allow us to be godlike in our abilities, to be omnipotent, omnipresent. We're going from individuals to a collected intelligence, a meta-intelligence.
I believe we're rapidly moving towards a world where all of these things that we use, that we need to be alive, if you would, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, are very rapidly trending towards zero cost. And it's going to change capitalism in a very fundamental fashion. So there's models for what this looks like, and one of the best models, believe it or not, is the early Star Trek world. Gene Roddenberry, who created Star Trek, viewed that world as being sort of post-capitalism, where money had very little use, very little value. At the end of the day, in a world in which technologies like the replicator exists, your ability to actually create something and have something where scarcity no longer exists, where everything becomes abundant, changes the whole economic sphere of our world.
And I've thought about how the technology that we're creating today at an exponential rate, literally the human-machine interface technology of ultimately being able to plug in through optogenetics or human-machine chip interfaces, and the internet, of course, are giving us the ability to communicate in a much more intimate fashion where I think well within the next decade there's going to be the potential for me to know people's feelings and thoughts in a much more intimate fashion. And if all of a sudden we are becoming a species of 7 billion interconnected individuals, what I call a meta-intelligence. We are a new organism, just like, yes, we're 7 billion individuals, just like I'm a collection of 10 trillion individual cells, but these 10 trillion cells become conscious as an individual named Peter Diamandis. And I think that on this planet, we are alive during a period of evolutionary change, where we are going from a collection of billions of individuals to a connected populace of humans interfacing with an extraordinary amount of artificial intelligence, computational power that's around the internet, where we together are becoming what I call this meta-intelligence. And one thing about becoming more of a virtual persona is that there are an infinite number of frontiers. In fact, I can work eventually with my AI, my artificial intelligence, and create a world that is of the dream I want to live in, and go and live in that world. And I can be the king, of my own world, and invite people to come in and be part of that. And I can invite you to come and play in my world. And we're going to have an infinite number of realities we can start to explore. Other benefits include our ability to become a spacefaring species, where the physical limitations of accelerating things to the speed of light, or of really needing to, remain alive for longer than the normal human lifespan will change, and we become liberated for our ability to go and populate this galaxy and this universe and what may be an infinite number of universes.
Kurzweil and his book The Age of Spiritual Machines, like his partner Diamandis, make the claim that everyone will be forced to become a machine hybrid and jack into the AI god if they hope to survive the future. Kurzweil writes, quote, "Regardless of the nature and derivation of a mental experience, spiritual or otherwise, once we have access to the computational process that give rise to it, we have the opportunity to understand its neurological correlates. With the understanding of our mental processes will come the opportunity to capture our intellectual, emotional, and spiritual experiences, to call them up at will, and to enhance them," end quote. Listen to him speak here, and he tells you what his true goal for the future really is.
Technology feeds on itself, and it gets faster and faster. In about 40 years, the pace of change is going to be so astonishingly quick that you won't be able to follow it unless you enhance your own intelligence by merging with the intelligent technology we're creating.
You said that our ethical system is based on the idea of consciousness. Our economic system has been based on scarcity and friction. What about a world where, as you say, we can make anything out of anything at any time? Would that change the entire economic structure in the world?
Well, we will keep, there'll still be money in the future, and we will still have an economic system based on money. However, I've written that we'll achieve the goals of communism through a combination of the law of accelerating returns and the open source movement.
And there it is. Everything he does is to push toward technocratic communism. Again, the law of accelerated returns is his own made-up theory. It states that replicator technology, 3D printers, and nanobots will bring about a massive swell in abundance that will drive the cost of things down to practically free.
And I remember when I was in junior high school, this was at the height of the sort of Red Scare, and communism was this very big bogeyman. And our social studies teacher wrote the goals of communism on the board, and it was from each according to his ability and to each according to his need. And he said, well, what's so bad about that? And we're all whispering to each other, is he coming? But we couldn't actually come up with a good answer as to what was wrong with that. What was wrong with it was the system used to go achieve that goal or try to go towards it, which was forced collectivism. A different kind of collectivism, I think, will get us there, which is the collectivism of freedom and self-organizing people who can contribute to the growth of knowledge.
Open source, obviously, is the idea of shared intellectual property, which is his idea of non-forced collectivism. In other words, you don't get to own your intellectual property, but will be forced in this non-forced forcing to make it available to the public for free. But markets will somehow magically thrive because there does exist people who will actually pay for free things. So there's that. You can all relax now.
So, I mean, right now, if you want music, movies, books, there are millions of these items for free. There are also robust book publishing industries, and despite discussion of crisis in those industries, they're actually as big as ever, because people still spend money for proprietary forms of that information. But if you were very poor, you could actually entertain yourself pretty well with the free forms.
Listen carefully to his straw man. We can make anything out of anything at any time. Is he suggesting that with nanobots and 3D printers, one can manifest limitless materials right out of thin air at zero cost? Can you make food with a 3D printer? How is that done?
We'll actually be able to live quite well with open sources of information. You say, oh, but you're going to need a three-dimensional printer. Well, right now you can print out 70% of the parts on your three-dimensional printer to build another three-dimensional printer. That will be 100% within 10 years. And so people will be able to print out, if you send one three-dimensional printer to Nigeria, they'll be able to print out a second one, and the two will print out four will print out 8, and pretty soon everybody in Nigeria can have their own three-dimensional printer. This will be very inexpensive technology. You'll be able to live very well with open sources of information. Nonetheless, there'll be robust markets for proprietary forms of all of those kinds of information.
He is telling you that there are two specific groups of people in his futuristic world. Those who operate from money on one plane of existence, and the poor who take the scraps that fall from the rich man's table. The World Game, a computer game envisioned by Buckminster Fuller, was intended to be the alternative to War Games, the machine learning system that uses game theory developed by von Neumann and others that came out of Rand Corporation and is used by the Pentagon to strategize winning moves in war scenarios. Remember the 1983 movie War Games? The object of the World Game was to create solutions to overpopulation and the uneven distribution of resources by working through given scenarios and without competing with anyone or working independently. The idea was to, quote, make the world work equally for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation without ecological damage or disadvantage to anyone, end quote. Of course, development of the game was never actually realized, its colossal failure never publicized. For the game to actually work, it must first be fed all of the world's data, like the data you'd gather from Google. One can only assume that since this utopian ideal is founded upon a faulty thesis to begin with, it makes the game unable to resolve the programmed paradoxes, which is, of course, the driving motivation for AI in the first place.
Talking about AI, I realized, like, oh, well, this is a genie that once it's out of the bottle, you're never getting it back in.
That's true.
Are you honestly, legitimately concerned about this? Is like AI one of your main worries?
Yes, it's less of a worry than it used to be, mostly due to taking more of a fatalistic attitude.
How far away are we from something that's really, truly sentient?
I mean, you could argue that any group of people, like a company is essentially a cybernetic collective of people and machines. Is there sort of like a collective AI in the Google sort of search, you know, where we're all sort of plugged in as like nodes on the network, like leaves on a big tree. We're all feeding this network without questions and answers. We're all collectively programming the AI, and and Google plus all the humans that connect to it are one giant cybernetic collective. It feels like we are the biological bootloader for AI, effectively. We are building it. But the AI is informed, strangely, by the human limbic system. It is, in large part, our id writ large. We mention all those things, the sort of primal drives. There's all things that we like and hate and fear. They're all there on the internet. They're a projection of our limbic system.
The 1983 movie War Games was an interesting work of predictive programming. The story makes the case for AI as superior to humans, starting with military wartime applications that ultimately brings about the strategy for world peace. Straight out of the Stuart Brand cyber hippie cult, the main character is a teenage boy who is interested in computers and gaming and feels perfectly entitled to hack into a gaming company to sample its intellectual property, but instead accidentally hacks into NORAD's AI system, launching a thermonuclear world war. The main character's name is Lightman, and characterized as an underachiever, disinterested in mainstream education, and ripe for recruitment by the Soviets. He's coming of age in the enlightened domain of Silicon Valley. War Games gives one of the earliest mainstream introductions to the computer nerd, the gamer, the hacker persona, as well as the normalization of certain psychological disorders to be exploited for specific roles for laborers in the coming technocracy, which I talked about in my Ad Astra video a few years back. Astronauts and schizoaffective disorder, as in the case with Ad Astra. whose antisocial nature and flat affect seem perfect for long-term space travel. And neurodivergent spectrum disorders for programming and software development portrayed by the idiot savant they introduce in the movie as the assistant to a senior developer that closely resembles a young Steve Wozniak. Incidentally, Wozniak and Jobs were part of the Homebrew Computer Club, of which Stuart Brand was a member. In the Rolling Stone article, Brand explained that, quote, AI is one of the perhaps several dozen computer research centers that focus on cultivating young programmers and even working with autistic children, trying to get them to relate to computers first and then later to people, end quote. This isn't the first representation of the spectrum-disordered enlightened gamer, however. The first one comes from a British rock opera from the 1970s, composed by Pete Townshend and performed by The Who, called Tommy. I did a video on this some years back. Pete Townshend was a devotee of Guru Meher Baba. Baba claimed he was the human incarnate of God, the avatar of God. Baba was also a member of the British elite roundtable conferences and joined the Hollywood circles a bit later through Aldous Huxley's wife's connections. The premise of the film was shaped by Townshend's industry handler that converted the storyline from a rock star idol to a gaming champion turned enlightened messiah.
At the time, which I suppose we're talking about getting towards the end of, I may have these dates wrong, but I think we were still recording at the end of 68 and rolling over into 69 with the final work. Is that right? Yeah. I'm polishing off really through that Christmas and New Year break between 68 and 69. And there was a young guy that Kit Lambert and Chris Stamp, our managers, became friendly with, called Nick Cohen, N-I-K-C-O-H-N, who was the youngest record reviewer to work on a national newspaper. He got a job at The Guardian. And he was a bit of a Who fan, and we invited him down to hear the work. This is pre-Pinball Wizard, which was really not about pinball at all. It was about a young man who's traumatically thrown into deaf, dumb and blindness, into a kind of autistic deaf, dumb and blindness. His parents throw the book at him, society throws the book at him. You know, he's used and abused and used as a testbed for all kinds of nutty projects. And then simply by the miracle of seeing his own image in the mirror and his mother smashing the mirror, is released from the psychological trap, the traumatic trap that he's in. And as a result of that, becomes a big figure in his community as a spiritual leader. Now that was the story of Tommy as it was. Nick came to hear it and he said, it's good. And I said, you don't seem convinced. He said, it's a bit boring. And I said, what do you mean? He said, you know, does it have to be about this God stuff? He said, it's also passé, you know. And of course, this was long before the God stuff became passé. You know, he was a bit of a dry one. And so I said, well, what can we do? He said, I don't know. He said, I just think it's a bit boring. He said, you know, it's great. It's a considerable achievement. It's boring. In the previous months, he and I had been out playing pinball all the time. He was halfway through a book called Arthur with an F, The Pinball Queen. And which, if you struggle to find, you can still find it. Really interesting book, a story about a young girl who becomes a pinball champion. And we used to play with the girl that it was based on, Arthur. And so this was in my mind, and I started to tease him a little bit back because he was teasing me a bit. And I said, so what about if instead of just becoming like a spiritual leader, like a kind of a pseudo rock star thing, you know, what about if he was a pinball champion? And Nick said, now that would be interesting. He said, but that's my idea.
In the film, the main character is thrown into an autistic-like state through a traumatic event where he witnesses the death of his war hero father. The only way he connects to the world in any meaningful way is through the game, and becomes an international pinball champion and then later worshipped as a messianic figure. In one scene, his stepfather mocks him through, you guessed it, more trauma from war imagery in a video game. This propels Tommy to a cyber realm of esoteric video game imagery that crescendos at his father, and who from his wisdom from the other side leads him into the quote-unquote light, seen here as an illumined disc-like portal. This autistic loss of connection to his senses and the outside world is seen as the necessary vehicle for his transformation. The road to enlightenment, or being quote-unquote Christed, means blocking out your natural senses and your connection to the world and all the people around you and devoting entirely to the game. Here's a sample of the lyrics to Amazing Journey, the score behind this scene, where at one point the boy in his trauma-induced state experiences an ascended master and then goes on to be a leader of this gnosis, this esoteric wisdom himself. A vague haze of delirium creeps up on me. All at once a tall stranger I suddenly see. He's dressed in a silver sparkled glittering gown, and his golden beard flows nearly to the ground. Sickness will surely take the mind where minds can't usually go. Come on the amazing journey and learn all you should know. He is your leader. He is your guide. Other points of interest in this film are the stacks used in Ready Player One. The MK Ultra style altars. The use of psychedelics as a form of spiritual medicine. And all the Luciferian, Theosophical, and Freemasonic symbols, like this one. Did you see it? I'll show it to you again.
When I read Ready Player One, it was the most amazing flash forward and flash back at the same time.
I was born in 2025, but I wish I'd grown up in the 1980s. Like Halliday and Morrow, like all my heroes.
There's a dystopian society and the fabric of our economy is crumbling. It's a good time to escape. So virtual reality will be a super drug.
Again, I think that the biggest question maybe in economics and politics of the coming decades will be what to do with all these useless people. Food will not be a problem. With that kind of technology, you will be able to produce food to feed everybody. The problem is more boredom and what to do with them, and how will they find some sense of meaning in life when they are basically meaningless, worthless. My best guess at present is a combination of drugs and computer games.
Lightman is shown performing simple hacks, which was repackaged a decade later in the 1995 movie Hackers. Lightman is trying to hack into a gaming company called Protovision. Notice the ad for Protovision is showing only males. You know, I really hate to do this because it will reveal my age. But not only was I the same age as Lightman in 1983, I was a first-generation gamer too. And if you haven't noticed, I am a woman. Sometimes you must consult the wise elders of the Nerd Council, and I am here only to serve. You're welcome. As you can see, the social planners in the 1980s were working diligently to steer women away from not just gaming, but tech jobs in general. According to the overlords, women are not designated for labor in these sectors, you see.
Oh, I worry about that kid. What? I don't know, sometimes I think we're all going to get electrocuted.
This corn is raw.
I know, isn't it wonderful? It's so crisp.
Of course it's crisp, it's raw.
No, it's terrific. You can just taste the vitamin A and D in here. It's great.
Of course, the film revolves around the AI system, developed by a man who thinks and looks exactly like Stuart Brand.
Once upon a time, there lived a magnificent race of animals. They dominated the world through age after age. They ran, and they swam, and they fought, and they flew. Until suddenly, quite recently, they disappeared. Nature just gave up and started again. We weren't even apes then. We were just these smart little rodents hiding in the rocks.
There is an interesting introduction to AI hallucinations portrayed with this storyline. Hallucinations so powerful as to deceive even the elect.
It's bluff, John. Call it off. No, it's not a bluff. It's real.
General, what you see on these screens up here is a fantasy, a computer-enhanced hallucination.
Do you really believe that the enemy would attack without provocation, using so many missiles, bombers, and subs? You are listening to a machine.
Are you getting a lot of hallucinations?
Yes, which is expected. No one in the field has yet solved the hallucination problems. All models do have this as an issue.
Is BARD safe for society?
The way we have launched it today, as an experiment in a limited way, I think so.
In the movie Hackers, the same character profile of the counterculturalist cyber hippie is presented but repackaged for 90s high school cyberpunks. In one scene, Zero Cool, scripted as some hacker white hat, quotes Allen Ginsberg, a Tavistock operative, and of course taking the prose completely out of context.
Angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo in the machinery of the night. It's Ginsberg.
Of course, they tell you exactly who this is from. Who do you think it is? Obvious? No?
I'm in love with the human race. I think the human animal is really a fine animal. This combination of fur and nakedness. I'm really proud of them. From where they've come from, being a hairy ape and Australopithecus, to what they've done now, just staggers me. What is behind it? I can only give my feelings are that I don't believe in the usual personal God. I do feel there is a gigantic plan afoot, probably more complex than anything you can ever get into holy books. But I feel that we're an important part of it. Whatever this thing is that is consciousness is very much a part of it. I don't know what we're hooked to. The wisdom of the plan is that we're trapped on this little planet, this speck of dust here. I have no doubt that we will grow to the point that we'll be able to attempt star travel. I think that will be our growing up period, our adolescence to adulthood. And then we probably will meet the first other intelligent forms.
Gene Roddenberry has said that his Star Trek series is rooted in the revolutionary thought of Lenin's vision of a galactic federation. It's been widely reported that his Star Trek series originated with Vice Admiral and Navy intelligence operative Leslie Stevens, creator of the Outer Limits television series, and that Stevens was probably responsible for the bulk of the Star Trek content. Stevens also created Battlestar Galactica and Buck Rogers in the 25th century. He was a leading expert in aerospace engineering and headed top Navy aerospace facilities at various points during his career. According to internationally recognized author and geopolitical scholar Dr. Michael Salla, Stevens' connections were so deep that the intelligence community could have been feeding him classified material and/or speculative briefings to sound out before the public in a highly charged dramatic context. Stevens had a hotline straight to the highest echelons of the technocratic military establishment. He was naval attaché in Moscow from 1947 to 1950, was on the National Security Council under Eisenhower, and was instrumental in the formation of NASA and other more exotic projects. His resume is such that he was a very likely candidate for membership on Majestic 12 or a similar working group. Given Stevens' role in military intelligence and his lifelong deep interest in esotericism, the Gnostic themes in the franchise's long history have been credited to Stevens. The unaired pilot episode, The Cage, and its later reworking in The Menagerie, is so saturated with Gnostic Freemasonic cosmology it's obnoxious. Captain Pike, a character created to represent Sovereign Grand Commander of Freemasonry Albert Pike, responds to a distress call from a planet run as a laboratory-type human zoo, operated by big-brained androgynous cousins of Crowley's Iwas, called the Telosians. The Telosians are emotionless telepathic masters of illusion, who use their illusory abilities to create fake reality scenarios and then insert their human subjects, which they see as primitive animals, so they can passively observe and study their habits and rituals. It's become a deviant compulsion for these characters, a somewhat addictive source of entertainment, rather than for the sake of obtaining useful scientific knowledge. In the episode Return of the Archons, Beta 3 is a prison planet inhabited by a mind-controlled, cult-like population that rather conveniently looks like America in the mid-20th century. Speaks volumes. In an article in the New York Times, speaking on the influence of Roddenberry's Star Trek, which appears to have been a social engineering effort targeting boomers, quote, feeding on this tension, science fiction and futurism entered their quote-unquote golden age by the 1950s and 60s, both predicting the bright future that would replace the Cold War. Technological advances would automate society, the necessity of work would fade away, industrial wealth would be distributed as a universal basic income, and an age of leisure and vitality would follow. Humans would continue to voyage into space, creating off-Earth colonies and perhaps making new extraterrestrial friends in the process, end quote.
There will be fewer and fewer jobs that a robot cannot do better. And I want to be clear that these are not things that I think that I wish would happen. These are simply things that I think probably will happen. If my assessment is correct and they probably will happen, then we need to say, what are we going to do about it? And I think some kind of a universal basic income is going to be necessary. Now, the output of goods and services will be extremely high. So with automation, there will come abundance. Almost everything will get very cheap. The much harder challenge is, how do people then have meaning? They derive their meaning from their employment. If you're not needed, if there's not a need for your labor, what's the meaning?
It's suggested that Roddenberry was further connected through his spin-off Deep Space Nine to an influential UFO cult called the Council of Nine out of the Esalen Institute. Esalen was founded by theosophist, master hypnotist, and two-term captain in the U.S. Army Chemical Center in Edgewood, Maryland, Andrea Puharich, who earlier in 1948 created the Round Table Foundation to study psychic phenomena and wrote several books, one of his earliest works titled The Sacred Mushroom, in which he sees these compounds as this chemical stargate, the U.S. military-industrial complex guided by men such as Allen Dulles and Nelson Rockefeller, and spurred by the Rand Corporation's 1949 Janus Report on the importance of mind control for national security, believed in the necessity to beat the Soviets at the game of psychic warfare. It launched the research effort into human consciousness and neuroelectronics, carried out by pioneering scientists and military officers such as Drs. Jose Delgado, John Lilly, Timothy Leary, and Andrea Puharich, all attached to major academic institutions. Puharich's Round Table Foundation's central figure since 1952 was a visiting Indian sage and medium from Bombay named Maharshi Vinod, whose alleged supernatural channeling powers were reflected in the creation of the Star Trek series by a member of the Puharich group, Gene Roddenberry, in 1966. Puharich, who had begun his work at the Edgewood Military Laboratory with funding from the OSS, allegedly at the behest of the American Defense Department, and prominent Freemason and former Vice President Henry Wallace, the man responsible for putting the mystical pyramid on the back of the US dollar bill, in the early 1970s, he invited the Israeli medium and intelligence asset Uri Geller to the US and submitted him to a battery of tests. Puharich was considered a master in alternative worldview creation and narcotic-enhanced hypnotism. When Puharich brought Vinod in 1952, he relayed a series of messages he claims are from the quote-unquote Council of Nine, a group of ascended masters who were once worshipped as the Great Ennead of ancient Egypt. The Great Ennead were the 9 gods of ancient Egypt who reigned over the whole world from Heliopolis, Egypt's capital city of the sun, for centuries, until other conquering factions like the Greeks and later the Romans impacted that influence. The change, however, wasn't complete until the arrival of Jesus, of which the Ennead then seemed to simply fade into oblivion, or as the mystery teachings go, they retreated back to the heavenly realm, claiming to return at a later date in their own second coming. An interesting read in this regard is The Stargate Conspiracy. I'm in the middle of this book now, in which the author points out that it was infamous occultist Aleister Crowley and his wife Rose who first introduced the idea of the 9 gods of the Great Ennead through their magical working in Cairo in 1904, which greatly inspired later claims of contact with ancient Egyptian gods that not only control the universe but also created man. The account goes that Puharich engaged narco-hypnosis on Geller in his research experiments to try to discover from where his paranormal spoon-bending abilities derived. Geller claimed he was channeling an entity called Spectra, who is supposed to be a conscious supercomputer aboard a spaceship. Puharich suggested that Geller might be in connection with the Nine, of which Spectra supposedly agreed. It was later suggested that the Nine had programmed Geller as a child. Everyone who came to Puharich for his research was hypnotized, and every one of them came away believing they were in contact with extraterrestrials. In 1973, Geller rejected any connection to the Nine, concluding that the hypnotic trance, the leading questions, and the post-hypnotic suggestions from Puharich tampered with his own subconscious. Puharich takes Channeler Vinod's claims so seriously that he started a new institute called Lab 9, devoted to the teachings of the Nine. In November of 1952, Puharich presented a paper on ESP and psychological warfare at the Pentagon Conference. In the following month, he brought the Nine through Vinod, and by 1953, Puharich was officially placed into psychological warfare research that focused on induced ESP mind control in the form of hearing radio waves via implants, psychedelics, narco-hypnosis, MK-Ultra experiments on prisoners and mental ward patients, in collaboration with Professor of Philosophy Oliver I. Reiser, chairman of the International Committee on Scientific Humanism. The Nine, however, was part of a military psychological warfare plan for a new global ET Ancient Aliens religion. Puharich had connections to a lineage of theosophical, Luciferian, UN-connected mystics and Fabian socialists like people from the Alice A. Bailey camp, her many contemporaries, and their notion of a scientific humanist religion that's needed for social control in the post-apocalyptic world. I always found it curious that part of Marshall Applewhite's message echoed the desires of the Fabian transhumanists in his insistence that they needed to shed their physical bodies in order to board a special spacecraft to escape the deliberate nuking of the Earth so it can be spaded over and restored for a new race of humans. Puharich embraced the apocalyptic view that nuclear radiation would help the Earth evolve spiritually, which he called radio eugenics as radiation hormesis.
You know, intelligent human beings should realize that everything has their cycle. They have their season. They have their beginning. They have their end. They have cycles. We're not saying that planet Earth is coming to an end. We're saying that planet Earth is about to be refurbished, spaded under, and have another chance to serve as a garden for another human civilization.